You're listening to EdTech Heroes, a podcast that looks at how teachers in today's classrooms can use technology to improve student learning. In each episode, a hero in the world of education will share their story and discuss how innovation can influence the minds of the next generation. Let's jump in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to EdTech Heroes. I'm Nef, and today's guest is Jake Miller. Jake has been a technology integration specialist in the Orange City School District in Ohio, a math and science teacher, and is the author of the educational duct tape book and host of the podcast of the same name, all of which helped him earn a spot on the prestigious EdTech K-12 magazine's top 30 to follow in 2020. Jake, welcome to EdTech Heroes.
Hi, Nef. I'm so excited to be here. It's good to see you today.
It's good to see you as well. And I feel like I am in the presence of royalty now that you've been named to this list.
Well, now on that list is like two years in the past. Like I felt so excited, and then like 6 months later they released the next list, and I was like, oh no, I'm just a has-been, I guess. But yeah, I was very excited about it, and it's cool being in the company of the other people that's on that list. Like when it happened, I was like, how cool is this? And I scroll down through it, and I'm like, whoa, look at the other people that are on here. A lot of people that I follow, a lot of people that I respect or have read books by or listen to podcasts from or have watched keynotes from. So yeah, it's really cool to be on that list.
Yeah, for sure. The fact that 2020 is 2 years ago is kind of bonkers
Right.
to me.
Right?
I think of 2017 as
Yes,
yesterday.
that's for sure.
So talk to us a little bit. I have been following your work probably for the last 4 or 5 years, but for listeners who might be a little bit less familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about what the past 5 years has been like for you and what landed you on that list?
Yeah. So, man, what a lot of change that has happened in those last 5 years for me professionally. So, I started off, came out of college, and I really just wanted to be an educator. Like, I loved teaching, I loved math, and I loved science, and that's what I wanted to do was be an educator. And through my years of educating, I found that I was really, really excited about educational technology. And as excited as I was about that teaching moment, the teachers always reference where they say, like, when the kid finally gets it and has that aha moment, like that's the moment for them. For me, I found that I liked that, but what I liked even more was when a teacher who was feeling apprehensive about using technology realized that they could do it and saw a place to fit it into their classroom. And I found that was the real big payoff for me. So when I realized that, just by doing stuff within my own school district at the time as a teacher, I kind of redirected my path a little bit to focus on supporting educators with educational technology. So took on a position as a tech coach, took on a leadership role in a committee in my school district, started presenting at conferences, started a blog, started a podcast, and just started doing as much as I could to support educators, because I was like, this educational technology stuff can really reinvent the way we do things in our classroom. And it's funny because thinking back, some of the earliest presentations I did were about about actually using Screencastify on Chromebooks, right? And looking at Screencastify and how much it's evolved, I think is a good sign, or a good metaphor for how much everything has evolved in educational technology, looking at what the tool looked like back then in 2017 or 2018 versus what it looks like now. So I've just been on this journey of supporting educators any way I can with EdTech, while also keeping my other foot inside of the classroom teaching too.
Yeah, certainly. And it's interesting that you bring up this metamorphosis that tools like Screencastify have undergone, as well as folks like yourself. The things that you are preaching and talking about have changed as education has changed and as teachers have changed. So it's pretty cool to kind of take a stroll down memory lane and think about how much things have evolved. Certainly, the best practices are still very similar, and the things that we're talking about are still in that same conversation. But what technology can do for classrooms today is unheard of, even if we were talking about just having this conversation in 2017.
Yeah, for sure. And like, look at us now here in 2022 that we're able to do, a video conference like this and turn it into a podcast. Like that was like unheard of back then. But you're right. The best practices of what we do in the classroom and what we know to be best for students, those haven't changed. It's just our ability and our the ease of finding tools that could do that stuff for us. That's what's really changed now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love your articulation there in terms of the inroad being the same, but the vehicles that we have to
Mhm.
get there are now much faster, much more sleek, and we get to employ all of those to get to the same destination, which is really, really cool. I did hear that you are a Wordle fan. Is that true?
That is true. I don't share my scores on Twitter every day like some folks, but I have a group text message with my wife and my son. They have 3 kids, and my 12-year-old in particular is into it. And I get up and get out the door of the house for work before either of them are out of bed yet. And so I do it when I get to work as I'm settling in my day. Don't tell my boss. And then I send them my scores, and then they send me their scores. So yeah, I love the Wordle. I love that little challenge. It's a good way to start our brains going in the day. Are you a Wordle person, Neff?
I am obsessed with Wordle. We have a Slack channel where we all share our scores, and I love it both as a mental challenge, but there's also something that's really special about everybody having the same word every day and being able to have this conversation about different strategies and
Mm,
different guesses and all
mm.
that jazz. So, I got to ask, how many tries did it take you to get Wordle today?
Oh, let's see. I think today was a 3, which I felt pretty excited about. Let's see. I'm gonna open up my phone. Oh, I accidentally went to my Nerdle tab because I do Nerdle too. Oh, today was 3. Yeah, I was 3. How about you?
I'm jealous. So here's what happened. I thought I was going to get it in 3. I had 5 out of 6 in 3. And since this is going to air in a while, I think
Yeah.
my third guess was tasty and the
Yeah.
actual word was nasty. And it
Yeah.
took me 6 tries because I tried hasty, I tried pasty. The ones where there's one letter that can be off just infuriate me. And it seems like I always end up getting it in 6 tries when that's the case.
Yeah, I was listening to some Janet Jackson this morning, so my mind went right to nasty. Miss Jackson. Not
All
really.
right, maybe that's a strategy tomorrow. I need to
Yeah,
have an appropriate playlist in the
right.
background so that I
Get
can
psyched
make
up.
sure that I actually get this Wordle try. So, on your podcast, you talked a little bit about how Wordle is this amazing analogy for ed tech, that we have this collective conversation and we get to share our successes and our failures. And based on that, we grow. And I think that that has definitely been the case in Wordle, right? When the game first came out, we're all just throwing random words out and we think, okay, let's just see what happens. But as the game has developed and we've had more conversations about it, it's like, wait, there's actually a strategy to this
Yeah.
thing, right? And I'm curious, how do these two things compare? This word game craze and helping teachers implement ed tech in their classrooms.
Yeah, I think what intrigued me about the connection between Wordle and EdTech integration was that, Wordle when it started out was like it was out there for I don't know, a month or 2 months or something like that, barely getting played by anybody because it didn't have that social piece. But then when they added that social piece where, like you said, we all have the same word at the same time, we could all talk about our strategies at the same time and how we solve things, that social piece really ramped it up. And I think in some circles that's missing in education, but something like a podcast like this, for me to share what I do or for me to listen back to an old episode of EdTech Heroes and hear what somebody else did, or to be in an ed camp or in a Twitter chat or just in the staff lunchroom talking about different strategies, because like we don't all have the same word like we do in Wordle in our classrooms, but we all have the same kind of challenges and then we're all doing the same kind of job. And I could go about something with a slightly different strategy than somebody else's, but yet we can all get to good learning outcomes, right? And I could say, well, this is the way I start a lesson, right? Versus the way I start a Wordle. This is the way you start a lesson versus start a Wordle. And we all kind of have these strategies, and we find as we're putting things in our classroom where the things fit and what things are like maybe a piece of a lesson, but maybe we don't have it in quite the right place. And so it really both parallels the social aspect of Wordle, but also just kind of the problem solving aspect of Wordle, where we're kind of solving, like moving the pieces around of our lessons and of our content and of our curriculum to get things to fit just right.
Certainly, certainly. I completely understand that. And I think back to my teaching days, and I don't know if this is something that you relate to, but going to the teacher's lounge and being able to share a problem, right?
Mm,
And it might be that there's a
mm,
math teacher there, there's a social studies teacher, and I taught in middle school in the early days. So it might be that we actually span different grade levels. And once you get an opportunity to throw that problem out into the ether, you're exactly right. Everybody is approaching it a little bit differently. And the sixth grade teacher might say, hey, the way that I am able to manage my classroom effectively is I let my kids get those giggles out, right?
mm,
And that might be something that feels
mm,
like it is a little bit lower than me as an eighth grade teacher, but it's like, maybe there is something to that. Maybe if I
right,
try this, this is going to
right.
be helpful. And you can go in and you can try it, and maybe it works and it's amazing. And maybe it doesn't. But the really cool thing in teaching, just like in Wordle, is that you get a new challenge every day. So
Mhm,
even if that original one didn't
mhm.
quite work out the way that you wanted to, you can say, okay, today I'm going to do what the seventh grade math teacher told me to try. And I can keep trying until I find this effective strategy that is actually going to move both me and my students along.
Right. Well, and the other a thing that kind of interests me about it is we talk a lot about on the Educational Duct Tape podcast, my podcast about what's called the adjacent possible, and it's the idea that what's possible for us is expanded by what we're adjacent to, and I like to think of that as the ideas we're adjacent to, right? So if I hear like with Wordle, like, oh, this is my starting word, and I'm like, well, I don't think that starting word is the best one because it has this one rare letter in it that's not going to show up that often. But I like the way you've got 4 vowels in that word, so maybe I could think of a different word that has those 4 vowels in it. So maybe I take their idea directly, or maybe I take their idea and tweak it a little bit, right? And the same thing works in their classroom, where maybe the sixth grade teacher that you're talking about in your story just lets them, I don't know, maybe they start off class with a dad joke and everybody giggles about it. Maybe another teacher's like, well, a dad joke isn't really my style. So instead we're going to, I don't know, do like look at a comic strip or do a drawing activity where we all draw a silly picture. So they're not doing the same exact strategy, but they're learning from the strategy. Or maybe they do the same strategy. Or maybe they're a teacher who's like, well, I really feel like a lesson should start off with something kind of formal because they were just in the hallway being goofy. So we start off with something formal, like an example problem, but then maybe that's a good time for our giggle time, right after that, right? So everybody takes as their different take on it, but if we talk about it, which we don't do often enough, but if we do, we can learn from each other's strategies and tap into that adjacent possible, and then share back what worked for us and things like that too.
I really like this idea of the adjacent possible because it allows you to turn this one idea into infinite ideas. Maybe this year you start with the dad joke because that's what conducive to your students. Maybe next year you start with something serious. And I know, especially as a secondary teacher, we might even make those changes period by period, understanding the personality of those folks and then understanding what ideas are going to best resonate with the personality of that period.
Yeah. Yeah, and I talk a lot about that with our integration with educational technology is we all have our own unique set of problems or challenges and curriculum and technologies available to us and students in our classroom and student motivation levels and student personalities and our own styles. So yeah, so when we take in that adjacent possible from somebody else, it's about putting it in our own lens and our own lens for that specific period or
Mhm.
curriculum or unit or school year, and certainly the way I do things this year, when we've been in person is different from what I was doing last year, where for part of the year I was concurrent and part of the year I was remote, right? We take it all based on our lens. And this year I've got a particularly silly group of students. So I might do things slightly different from last year where I had a more mature group of students, right? So yeah, we take that lens and think about the exact scenario we're in when we make our choices for whether it's the tech we're using or just the strategy we're using.
For sure. And I think the other thing that is at the heart of this adjacent possible is the willingness to fail a little bit, to try something on for size and then realize that perhaps it didn't quite work for this group of students in the way that we thought it would. And I know that you preach this idea of experimentation all the time. I'm curious what experimentation you and the teachers that you work with are currently doing with video.
So yeah, so I'm big on, you're not gonna like. I listen to a lot from a guy named Seth Godin, who's an expert in kind of marketing and things like that, and he talks. He uses the quote, "Just ship it." Like you're not gonna find out
Mhm,
how something works until you put it out there. So sometimes in our lessons, we just need to try out a strategy and see how it works, right? So recently, for example, with just off the top of my head, an example with video, when I give a formative assessment, I like to have kids who struggled on it retake it, but I don't want to just go like, hey, you got a D this time. Here's a different version of the assessment. Now take it and let's see if you do better. We got to do something in between there, right? So what I'll do is I'll record a video lesson of myself going over the assessment and some of the key concepts from it. And the student has to watch that video before they could take the assessment. And that's a way like that. Like I know that maybe small group teaching and a remediation with that student is a best practice, but I don't have time to reteach all of
mhm,
those students who struggled on assessment. Video lets me do that, right? So I tried that out. And so now I get to look at the data and see, are these students who watch those videos and retake those assessments, are they improving? The nice thing, by the way, I promise I'm not kissing up to Screencastify because this is a Screencastify sponsored thing here, but I could see if the kid watched the video, which is so awesome. I can go like, you didn't watch the video yet. You can't retake the formative assessment yet. And they're like, yeah, I did. I know you didn't. I could see right here who watched the video. So that's one example, but it's always thinking about what's a challenge that I have in my classroom. So that's a particular
mhm.
challenge I had. Students are taking a formative assessment. They're not doing well. How am I going to reteach? Because that's what makes it formative. Or what am I going to do to help that student? But I don't have time to do it, right? So how am I going to manage that? So I always think, what is it the teacher me is trying to do? And then
Mhm.
what can EdTech me, substitute in to handle that problem?
For sure. And I like the hierarchy in which you've thought of those things, right? The first thing is to do things that are pedagogically sound. And then,
Mm,
secondary to that, is to be able to plug in technology. And we never want to think of it backwards. We don't use technology for the sake of using technology, we use it to meet an end goal. But I also love
yeah.
this idea of video playing this really paramount role in formative assessment and allowing
Mm,
students to be able to really understand where they might have faltered and how they can improve. And I know you're not kissing up to us, but I'm going to take the shout out to Screencastify because I do think it's awesome in terms of being able to see who has watched the video. And I
mhm.
think when we think about Seth Godin and this idea of marketing, I love that you are talking about, hey, just ship that thing out. And when we think about the really great marketers of the world, they're also using data to be able to understand whether or not that message is actually resonating. And I think where technology tools really make us powerful as educators is when they give us access to that level of data so that we can understand when we just shipped it, did it actually go over well,
Yeah.
or is there some improvement that we need to do here?
Yeah, absolutely. There's just so many different ways that we could gather that data, view that data, organize that data that 15 years ago, before we were using technology widely and before the technology had made the strides it's made now, it was harder to get that data and
Mm,
actually see that growth and see maybe what questions we're struggling on, what
mhm.
interventions are working, what things are having that effect. And now we have a lot of power in terms of data to be able to make those and inform those decisions. Just like a marketer would have, looking at, I mean, how many times that link was clicked on or how many
Mhm,
people
mhm.
watched that video and then went and made a purchase, right? We could see with our students, are their scores improving based on these things we're doing, or where are there difficulties and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I know that you also have spent a little bit of time not just thinking about teacher created video, but also thinking about student created video. And if I remember correctly, Screencastify Submit, which is our student assignment tool, appeared in one of your recent infographics. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how you're using student video in your science class?
The particular infographic you're talking about, it related to a chapter of my book, Educational Duct Tape, where the question that I was asking the teacher wearing my teacher hat was, how can I better assess my students' understanding of something, right? And I tell a story in the book, a little anecdote of how if you looked at me on the basketball court when I was a high school student and played on my high school basketball team, I was probably about 6'2" at the time, and I'm 6'4" now. I'm sure I imposed some fear in the opposing team when I walked out on the court, right? But then they saw me shooting layups and warm-ups and realized there was nothing to worry about, right? And the comparison then is a guy like Muggsy Bogues. If you're a basketball fan, you know Muggsy Bogues played for the Charlotte Hornets, an all-time great. He was 5 foot, I forget how many inches, one of the shortest, if not the shortest players ever in the NBA. And yet he leads the Charlotte Hornets organization in a lot of statistics and was an all-star and things like that. Amazing basketball player. But if you looked at the two of us side by side in our heydays, you would have thought that I was the better basketball player. And sometimes when we assess students, that's all we're seeing is that one thing. All you're seeing is my height, and all you're seeing is Muggsy Bogues' height. But you've got to bring in other ways to really assess the student, just like you had to bring in other ways to assess me and Muggsy Bogues. If we ran a race and if we both took turns dribbling, you would know who was the better player. It was Muggsy, not me, right? The one thing I had going for me was my height. And so with our students, we need to find better ways to measure their understanding. Sometimes it can be less efficient, but yet it's more effective, right? So if my students can turn in a video to explain their understanding of a process, then I'm going to know more about their understanding than if it's just a multiple choice test. So right now in science class, we're learning about the stages of mitosis that a cell goes through to divide during mitosis. Really riveting information, if you ask me. But if I can ask my students, like, which stage of mitosis is this, A, B, C, or D? Yeah, I'll know if they knew the right answer, but I'm not really going to know, did they just memorize the pictures or do they know what's actually happening? Whereas if I can have the students record a video and use Screencastify Submit, as you suggested, to submit that video to me, I could watch this 2-minute video and go like, oh yeah, Nef really does understand this concept. I could see like she's going through the exact stages. Or another student, I could see, well, they know what each stage looks like, but they don't really know what's happening in there. So I can identify my students. Normally, you know your students who are lost and you know your students who have some level of mastery. This lets you kind of break down that mastery to show the true gaps that are there if you take a video like that. Again, like I said, takes a little bit more time to assess, but that assessment is richer than once we do it.
Sure. And I think that it's really important that you bring up this intersection between efficiency and effectiveness. And earlier in the podcast, you were talking about how time is at a premium for educators. And I know every single educator listening to this is like, if I had a magic wand, I probably would give myself an extra hour in the day.
Yeah.
How do you justify assigning something that you know is going to take you more time to grade?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't always do it. It's impossible to always do that, right? So I need to make sure when I feel like I really need to zoom in on student understanding, then that's when I want it. Or maybe I don't do the video for all of the students, right? Maybe the video for the students who maybe a pre-assessment told me they were kind of on the borderline of comprehension or something like that. But the assessment or the justification for it, as you asked, is the Muggsy Bogues Jake Miller difference, right? If you just have one measure, who's the better basketball player, you might be thinking it's me. Whereas if you have more measures, you realize it's Muggsy Bogues. And I think the same thing happens with our student assessment. If we're always just assessing with multiple choice, we're not really knowing what our students' level of comprehension is. And something like video used in ways that work for us, when we can handle watching those videos and assessing those videos, I think really helps.
Absolutely. And it's not all or nothing, which I think is the point that you're making there, right? We might have something that is incredibly complex, like mitosis, from what I remember, although I can't say that I have used mitosis very much in my real life. I'm sorry, Jake. Um,
Your cells in your body are doing mitosis right now, Nef. You just are not thinking about it while it's happening.
okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I'll
All
take
my
it.
science nerds are like, yeah, Jake, tell her.
That's one person who is cheering you on right now and is the mitosis nerd. But certainly I do think that there is a lot of value in thinking about what are the things that we can do in the classroom that are going to produce really positive results. And even if those things are not the most efficient from a time perspective, then asking ourselves the question of how often can I do it to reap most of the rewards, right? And
Yeah.
maybe it's not a goal of reaping all of the rewards. Like you said, just ship it, just try it, get this insight this one time, even if
Mm.
it's not something that's replicable over and over and over again.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you think it's not replicable maybe, and then you try it and you're like,
Mm,
"Oh, that wasn't really that bad." Or maybe you think it's gonna be okay, and then you ship it and you find out, "Well, no, that was too much work." And then but you can't it's hard to really know until you give it a try, right? So that's why we just ship it, because that's kind of how we find out that stuff is through that process. And I should also point out too, if I do a video project with my students, sometimes I might not don't tell the kids, I might not watch all of them, right? Because I just the process of them going through recording that video,
mhm,
that's beneficial. So even if I don't watch it, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a good benefit out of it. So maybe I just go through and I watch the kids who I am wondering if they comprehend,
mhm,
and then I have a subset of kids who I know comprehend. I don't watch those ones, right? And then also, maybe I use those videos instead of for me to assess them. Maybe those students work together and
mhm.
give each other feedback on it. They're watching each other's videos and saying maybe where they're right or where they're wrong, or they're responding to each other and things like that. So it doesn't always have to be a situation where all of the students are recording these really long videos and then
Mhm.
I'm the one watching them. Or maybe it's just, we were talking about that reassessment piece there earlier. Maybe all of the students in the class take a multiple choice assessment, and then just the students who are kind of in the middle do this video assessment, so that I can pinpoint where their comprehension issues are, so that I could then give them targeted instruction to support them, right? So like you're saying, we think through, what is it that I'm trying to achieve with this video, and how can it work into, the realistic picture of what I do in my role.
Certainly, all fantastic tips. And I don't think that there is a teacher listening who has not found a place for a few papers in the trash can. So I will not tell your students if you promise not to tell my former
I won't.
students. It's just going to be a secret amongst all of us.
And it feels so good sometimes, doesn't it? You
I
plop them in
remember
there.
Absolutely. I remember I once had a trunk full in my Corolla and the quarter had passed and I pulled right up to the dumpster in my apartment and throwing those stacks in the trash was cathartic. I can still
Yeah.
remember the feeling of them lifting off of my consciousness.
It's just that simple step, and then we're like, "We're gone. I don't have to worry about that anymore."
Exactly, exactly. So I know that this infographic about using video in assessment is straight out of one of your newer books. Can you give us one more tip from the book? And I know that's hard to do, right? Because this is pages and pages of absolute gold. But
Oh,
if you
thanks.
could give us just one more tip to kind of prime us, what would you take out of the book?
So the book is split into kind of two parts. Every chapter has an anecdote and a message from me to help the teacher with their tech integration and their mindset. And then the second part is about a tech tools, like a question, like I said before, how can I assess my students? And in that one, Screencastify Submit was one of the suggestions. So on the other side of the idea is the idea of one of those anecdotes or tips for developing the teacher's mindset. And the main mindset that runs throughout the book is this educational duct tape idea, which is the idea that educational technology is like duct tape. It's just a
Mhm.
tool. By itself, we're never going like setting forth to use duct tape, and we should never set forth to just use educational technology. So I talk about how, there's a story I tell in the book how I had to patch my kids' bounce house that they like to play in, and I needed to find a tool to patch the bounce house. It was duct tape. And a similarity is I was talking about how I needed to give remediational support to my students who struggled on an assessment, and video was the tool to do
Mm.
that. So we talk in the book about how the educational technology is that tool. We want to start by thinking about, what's my problem, or what's my goal, what's my sound pedagogy that I need some support with, and where could that technology step in as a tool. And that's really an idea that I try to run throughout my podcast, throughout whenever I speak, and in the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so super duper important. And I like that you have adopted this lens of first thinking about an anecdote because it tells us really important things about how we solve problems and how we learn. And I know a lot of times for me, especially early on in my career, I had these ideas about how the world worked, but sometimes I open up my classroom door and it's like I forgot everything. So thinking about, okay, generally when we think about a screwdriver or duct tape or anything else, we're not out to use those things just for the sake of using them. We first think about the problem and then think about the tools that are available to us is such an important realization in terms of how we think about education.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And we so many times in an educational training or something like that, the teacher feels like we're being told prioritize this educational technology, but in
Mm,
reality, it's about what do we need to do for our students and what do we need to do to help them be successful, and we think about how those tools kind of fit into that idea. Yeah, for sure.
for sure. So we've had you on for a while and you've shared some really, really awesome tips. But I do have one more tip that I want you to share before we get out of here. We have a segment here where we ask every single one of our heroes to share a tip of advice for teachers. And I'm wondering if you can share one way that teachers can use video for assessment or otherwise, since you've written so much on the subject.
Yeah, my biggest use of video, one thing I haven't mentioned during this conversation, is to bring a flexible pacing into the classroom. I think
Mm,
all of our students learn and work and process information at different rates, and so we need to, whenever possible, build in some flexible pacing or some student pacing, as I normally call it, and I talk about that in the book and in my podcast as well. The idea of recording videos of our self-giving
mhm,
instructions for students to watch at their own pace and on their own timing. Like maybe that
mhm.
student, one student gets to that video on Monday, and the other student gets to it on Tuesday, another student gets to it on Wednesday, another student watches it on Monday and has to rewatch it on Tuesday. That's great because we're letting the student progress through the information at the pace that works for them, because they're all different. They all have different styles of learning. And the wonderful thing about doing that I found when I do it in my classroom is when I take the instruction away from the front of the classroom and I put it on the students' screens for whenever they're ready for that frees me up to move around the room.
Mhm,
That frees me up to build relationships with my students. That frees me up to support students who are struggling. That frees me up to ask questions for deeper learning of students. That frees me up to do some of that formative assessment through discussion and things like that. So whenever we can take that video and utilize it to bring some flexible pacing into our classroom, it's hugely beneficial, I think. Now, I should also point out too, I'm a realist, I'm in the classroom too. I don't always do that in my classroom because sometimes
mhm.
I just barely have the lesson ready to teach synchronously to everybody 2 minutes before the class period starts. And there wasn't time for a video that time. But I think that maybe in our second year of a curriculum, or maybe when we're a little bit ahead of ourselves, or maybe when we're able to team up with another teacher, we can make those videos happen. And when we can, I think they're hugely beneficial to our students because it empowers them to move at their own pace and to not feel overwhelmed when things are moving too fast, or to not feel bored when things are moving too slow, because they are able to move forward at the pace that works best for them. And we can use video for that. I think that's huge.
Asynchronous video to be able to allow students to move at their own pace is amazing. We had John Bergman on the podcast not too long ago, and you probably are familiar with John as being kind of this
Mhm.
big champion of flipped classrooms. And what he's been able to do in his classroom is absolutely incredible. However, I think that lots of teachers might say, hey, I'm not quite ready to flip my classroom entirely. And I think that what you just posited is this really cool middle step of saying
Mm.
that even if we don't want to have a full on flipped classroom, how might we be able to infuse tidbits of asynchronous video to give us some of those benefits? And I think
Yeah.
it's really cool that that is where you come from because I think that in lots of ways, it is very similar to this idea of just shipping, right? Like,
Hmm.
let's see if infusing some video is actually going to work, if it's going to lead to the benefits that we want. So I really, really enjoy that tip.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Final question. What are some of your favorite online resources to share with teachers?
Oh gosh, there's so much now, which is so great. And I think it really depends on what their preferred mode of learning is. I am a podcast listener because I have a 40-minute commute, and that's a perfect time to get my learning in, right? So I listen to podcasts, most of which are from the Educational Podcast Network, which I'm a part of. There's podcasts for EdTech, there's podcasts for all kinds of things. And I love the EdTech Heroes podcast as well. And there's a couple other ones I listen to that aren't in the network, but podcasts are great. And I recommend starting with the Education Podcast Network for looking for other ones. On Twitter, I absolutely love. There's a lot of people I follow on Twitter. So if people are getting on Twitter, hit me up. I have a list of people that I follow, and there's just so much good stuff out there, and they curate so much wonderful stuff. And then I'm a big believer in signing up for the newsletters from companies, because when Screencastify drops a new update, I get it in my inbox right away, and I know those things. So between podcasts and those newsletters and Twitters, I feel like that's where all my information comes from. So when somebody says, Jake, how do you know all this stuff about these ed tech tools? That's how. Those are the things that are bringing it to me.
I promise folks who are listening, we did not pay Jake to encourage you to sign up for our newsletter or other newsletters coming from other companies. But
Or
that
mine.
is, you know what? Exactly, right? All the newsletters, sign up for them all, because you are right. They really are a dearth of information and allow you to kind of get a sneak peek into lots of things. So I appreciate those tips. And Jake, I really appreciate you joining Ed Tech Heroes.
Oh,
Listeners,
thank you so much
be
for having me.
sure to follow Jake on Twitter. He is at Jake Miller Tech. I hear he has some amazing gifts over there, or maybe you pronounce it GIFs. Be sure to visit his website, jakemiller.net, for a wealth of resources that any educator can benefit from. And also make sure that you check out his new book, Educational Duct Tape, and his podcast by the same name. I am your host, Nef Dukes, and I am so looking forward to seeing all of you all next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of EdTech Heroes, presented by Screencastify.